Why avoidance seem cold after intimacy? One of the most confusing experiences in modern relationships is watching someone become deeply connected to you emotionally, only to suddenly become distant right after intimacy starts to grow. At first, they seem present, affectionate, emotionally available, and even vulnerable in ways that make the connection feel rare and meaningful. They open up just enough to make you believe the relationship is finally becoming real and emotionally secure. But then, almost without warning, something changes in their energy and behavior. Their messages become shorter, their tone becomes colder, and the emotional warmth that once felt natural suddenly disappears. And for the person on the receiving end, this emotional shift feels deeply painful and incredibly confusing. You start replaying every conversation in your mind, trying to understand what went wrong. You wonder if you said too much, became too emotional, or somehow ruined the connection without realizing it. But the truth is, avoidants often become emotionally cold after intimacy, not because they stop caring, but because intimacy itself activates fear inside them. What feels comforting and connecting to most people can feel emotionally overwhelming to someone with an avoidant attachment style. The closer they feel to someone emotionally, the more vulnerable and exposed they begin to feel internally. And instead of leaning into that vulnerability, they instinctively pull away from it. This is what many people misunderstand about avoidance. Their distance is not always about lack of feelings. In many cases, it is actually the opposite. The more emotionally significant the connection becomes, the more their nervous system begins to perceive intimacy as a threat to their independence, control, and emotional safety. So after moments of closeness, affection, or vulnerability, they often feel an intense subconscious need to regain emotional distance. That is why avoidance can appear warm one day and emotionally unavailable the next. To the outside person, it feels inconsistent and even cruel at times. But internally, the avoidant is often trying to regulate emotional discomfort that they don't fully understand themselves. Intimacy creates emotional pressure inside them because closeness requires openness, dependency, and trust. And for someone who learned early in life that emotional dependence was unsafe, intimacy can feel deeply destabilizing. Many avoidants grew up in environments where emotional needs were ignored, dismissed, or even punished. They may have learned that vulnerability leads to rejection, criticism, disappointment, or loss of control. So instead of learning to rely on emotional connection for comfort, they learned to rely only on themselves. Self-sufficiency became their emotional survival strategy. Distance became safety, and emotional independence became part of their identity. The problem is that relationships naturally require emotional closeness over time. And when avoidants begin to experience real intimacy, it conflicts with the protective emotional system they built years ago. Part of them may genuinely want love, connection, affection, and emotional closeness. But another part of them feels deeply uncomfortable when those things actually become real. This creates an exhausting internal push and pull dynamic. At first, avoidance may pursue connection enthusiastically because emotional intimacy still feels manageable at a distance. In the early stages, there is excitement, curiosity, chemistry, and emotional possibility without too much pressure. But once the relationship starts becoming emotionally deeper and more consistent, fear begins to surface beneath the connection. Suddenly, intimacy no longer feels exciting. It starts feeling consuming. That is when many avoidants begin emotionally deactivating. They stop responding with the same warmth and energy. They become more distracted, more distant, and less emotionally expressive. Some immerse themselves in work, hobbies, or personal routines to create space. Others become critical of the relationship or hyper-focused on small flaws in their partner. And sometimes they withdraw completely without clearly explaining why. To the person experiencing this behavior, it can feel incredibly personal. It feels like rejection. It feels like abandonment. It feels like emotional punishment for getting too close. But avoidants are often not consciously trying to hurt someone. In many cases, they are trying to escape the emotional pressure building inside themselves. What makes this dynamic even more painful is that avoidants often return once emotional distance has been restored. After space reduces their internal anxiety, they may suddenly become warm, affectionate, and emotionally engaged again. This creates a confusing cycle where closeness is repeatedly followed by withdrawal, and over time, the other person becomes emotionally exhausted trying to understand which version of the avoidant is real. The warm version feels loving and emotionally connected. The cold version feels detached and emotionally unreachable. And because these shifts happen repeatedly, the relationship starts feeling emotionally unstable. This is especially difficult for anxious partners who naturally seek reassurance, consistency, and emotional closeness during uncertainty. The more the anxious person reaches for connection, the more pressure the avoidant begins to feel internally. And the more pressure the avoidant feels, the more emotionally distant they become. This creates the classic anxious avoidance cycle that leaves both people feeling misunderstood and emotionally drained. The anxious partner begins chasing clarity and reassurance because the emotional distance feels threatening. Meanwhile, the avoidant begins protecting their space because emotional demands feel overwhelming to them. Both people are reacting to fear, but in completely opposite ways. One of the biggest mistakes people make with avoidance is assuming coldness means they never cared. Sometimes avoidants care deeply, but they lack the emotional tools to stay present during vulnerability and intimacy. They may genuinely miss the person while simultaneously avoiding deeper connection with them. This contradiction confuses even the avoidant themselves, and this is why logic rarely fixes the situation. You cannot simply explain someone out of attachment wounds that were built over years of emotional conditioning. Avoidants do not become emotionally distant because they suddenly forget your value. They become distant because closeness activates emotional defenses they learned long before you entered their life. That does not excuse hurtful behavior or emotional inconsistency. Understanding avoidant behavior does not mean tolerating emotional neglect forever, but it does help explain why intimacy often triggers withdrawal instead of stability. The deeper truth is this. Avoidants often fear losing themselves inside relationships. They fear becoming emotionally dependent, controlled, overwhelmed, or trapped. So when intimacy becomes too real, distance becomes their way of regaining emotional control. Unfortunately, this coping mechanism creates the very loneliness they are trying to avoid. Because while distance protects them from vulnerability temporarily, it also prevents the deep emotional safety they secretly crave. Many avoidants truly want connection. They want love. They want intimacy. But wanting intimacy and tolerating intimacy are two very different things emotionally. Real healing for avoidance begins when they stop viewing emotional closeness as danger. It begins when they learn that vulnerability does not automatically lead to pain, rejection, or loss of identity. And that kind of healing usually requires deep self-awareness, emotional work, and consistent effort over time. But for the person loving an avoidant, another truth is equally important to understand. You cannot heal someone by abandoning yourself emotionally. You cannot earn consistency by over-explaining your worth or suppressing your needs. And you cannot force emotional availability out of someone who is terrified of intimacy. Sometimes the healthiest thing you can do is stop personalizing their withdrawal. Their coldness after intimacy is often more connected to their internal fears than your actual value as a person. Because the painful reality is this. Avoidants often pull away most strongly, not when they feel nothing, but when they start feeling too much.